Welcome to the True Crime Never Sleeps podcast, the podcast where I share true crime stories for your entertainment. But you might lose some sleep after listening to some of these stories. I'm your host, Larry Leese. After reading about true crime stories, I condense all the content and bring valuable information to you. To stay up to date with all of my content, check out my Twitter account, TrueCrimeNS. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform like Good Pods. This show is sponsored by Poddex. And as always, we'd like to thank Poddex for sponsoring this episode. Poddex is an honest new tool for podcasters looking to have more meaningful conversations or gamify their podcast. Shuffle up, ask a question, let the content roll. Get yours today at poddex.com. Let the content roll. Don't forget to use the code Larry21 for 10% off your order. And in this season, it's all about infamous assassinations. And today, we're diving into the assassination / murder of Beatles legend John Lennon. On the evening of December 8th, 1980, English musician John Lennon, formerly of the Beatles, was shot and fatally wounded in the archway of the Dakota, his residence in New York City. His killer was Mark David Chapman, an American Beatles fan who was incensed by Lennon's lavish lifestyle and his comment that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Chapman said he was inspired by the fictional character Holden Caulfield from the novel The Catcher in the Rye, a phony-killer who despises hypocrisy. But before I go into detail on the whole story, let me give you some background information. So, starting out with Mark David Chapman, the killer. He was a 25-year-old former security guard from Honolulu, Hawaii. He was a fan of the Beatles with no prior criminal convictions. J.D. Salinger's novel, The Catcher in the Rye, had taken on a great personal significance for Chapman, to the extent that he wished to model his life after the novel's protagonist, Holden Caulfield. One of the novel's main themes is his rage against adult hypocrisy and phonies. Chapman claimed that he had been enraged by Lennon's infamous, much publicized remark in 1966 that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, and by the lyrics of Lennon's songs God, where Lennon states that he does not believe in God or Jesus, and Imagine, where Lennon altruistically states, imagine no possessions, yet had a lavish lifestyle as depicted in Anthony Fawcett's 1976 book John Lennon, One Day at a Time, making Lennon a phony. On October 27, 1980, Chapman purchased a 5-shot 38 caliber Charter Arms revolver in Honolulu, Hawaii for $169. Needing only a driver's license and to complete 2 forms. He flew to New York on October 29th after contacting the FAA to learn the best way to transport a revolver. Chapman learned that bullets can be damaged on the plane, so he arrived without ammunition, and therefore left New York on November 12th or 13th, took a flight back to New York on December 6th, and checked into the Upper West Side YMCA for a night before moving to a Sheraton hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Then, December 8th, 1980. Chapman waited for Lennon outside the Dakota in the early morning and spent most of the day near the entrance to the Dakota, talking to fans and the doorman. During that morning, Chapman was distracted and missed seeing Lennon step out of a cab and enter the Dakota. Later in the morning, Chapman met Lennon's family nanny, Helen Seaman, who was returning from a walk with Lennon's 5-year-old son, Sean. Chapman reached in front of the housekeeper to shake Sean's hand and said that he was a beautiful boy, quoting Lennon's song, Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy. Portrait photography, Annie Leibovitz, apologize, can't say her name right, went to the Lennon's apartment to do a photo shoot for Rolling Stone magazine. She promised them that a photo of the two of them naked together would make the front cover of the magazine. She took several photos of John Lennon alone, and one was originally set to be on the cover. Although she did not want to be naked, Lennon insisted that both he and his wife be on the cover. After taking the pictures, she left her apartment at 3:30 p.m. After the photo shoot, Lennon gave what would be his last interview to San Francisco DJ Dave Sholin for a music show to be broadcast on the RKO radio network. At around 5 p.m., Lennon and Ono, delayed by a late limo shared with the RKO radio crew, left their apartment to mix the song Walking on Thin Ice, an Ono song featuring Lennon on lead guitar, at the record plant. As they left the building, they are approached by Chapman, who asked for Lennon's autograph, a common practice, on a copy of his album Double Fantasy. Lennon liked to give autographs on pictures, especially to those who had been waiting for long periods of time to meet him. Later, Chapman said, "He was very kind to me, ironically very kind, and was very patient with me. The limo was waiting, and he took his time with me, and he got the pen going, and he signed my album. He asked me if I needed anything else. I said, no, sir. And he walked away, very cordial and decent man." Paul Goresh, an amateur photographer and a Lennon's fan, took a photo of Lennon signing Chapman's album. The Lennons spent several hours at the record plant, returning to Dakota at approximately 10:50 p.m. Lennon wanted to be home in time to say goodnight to his son, before going to the Stage Deli restaurant with Ono. The Lennons exited their limo on 72nd Street instead of driving into the more secure courtyard of the Dakota. The Lennons passed Chapman and walked toward the archway entrance of the building. As Ono passed by, Chapman nodded at her. As Lennon passed by, he glanced briefly at Chapman, appearing to recognize him from earlier. Seconds later, Chapman drew his gun, which was concealed in his coat pocket, aimed at the center of Lennon's back, and rapidly fired 5 hollow point bullets from a distance of about 9 or 10 feet. Based on statements made that night by New York City Police Department Chief Detective James Sullivan, numerous reports at the time claimed that before firing, Chapman called out "Mr. Lennon" and dropped into a combat stance. Later, court hearings and witness interviews did not include either Mr. Lennon or the combat stance description. Chapman said that he does not remember calling out to Lennon before he fired, and that Lennon did not turn around. He claimed to have taken a combat stance in a '92 interview with Barbara Walters. One bullet missed Lennon and struck a window of the Dakota. According to the autopsy report, 2 bullets entered the left side of Lennon's back, traveling through the left side of his chest and his left lung, with one exiting from the body and one lodged in his neck. 2 more bullets hit Lennon in his left shoulder. Lennon, bleeding profusely from external wounds and from his mouth, staggered up 5 steps to the security reception area, where he said, I'm shot. He then fell to the floor, scattering cassettes that he was carrying. Jose Perdomo, the doorman, shook the gun out of Chapman's hand and kicked it across the pavement. Concierge worker Jay Hastings first started to make a tourniquet, but upon ripping open Lennon's blood-stained shirt and realizing the severity of the musician's multiple injuries, he covered Lennon's chest with his uniform jacket, removed his blood-covered glasses, and summoned the police. Chapman removed his coat and hat to show he was not carrying any concealed weapons, and remained standing on West 72nd Street, waiting for police to arrive. Under his coat, he wore a promotional t-shirt for Todd Rundgren's album Hermit of Mink Hollow. Perdomo shouted at Chapman, "Do you know what you just did?" To which Chapman calmly replied, "I just shot John Lennon." Officers Stephen Spiro and Peter Colin were the first policemen to arrive at the scene. They were at 72nd Street and Broadway when they heard a report of shots fired in the Dakota. The officers arrived around 2 minutes later and found Chapman standing very calmly on West 72nd Street, reading a paperback copy of The Catcher in the Rye. They immediately put Chapman in handcuffs and placed him in the back seat of their squad car. Chapman made no attempt to flee or resist arrest. Colin said to Chapman, "He apologized to us for ruining our night." I turned around and said to him, "You gotta be fucking kidding me. You're worried about our night? Do you know what you just did with your life?" We read him his rights more than once. Officer Herb Frauenberger and his partner Tony Palma were the second team arriving on the crime scene. They found Lennon lying face down on the floor of the reception area, blood pouring from his mouth and his clothing already soaked with it. With Hastings attending to him, officers James Moran and Bill Gamble then arrived on the scene. Frauenberger put Lennon in their car. Moran and Gamble then drove Lennon to Roosevelt Hospital on West 59th Street. followed by the two who drove Ono to the hospital. According to Gamble in the car, Moran asked, "Are you John Lennon? Or do you know who you are?" To which Lennon nodded, but could only manage to make a moaning and gurgling sound when he tried to speak, and lost consciousness shortly after. The day after the murder, Lennon's remains were cremated at Ferncliffe Cemetery in Hartsdale, Westchester County, New York, and his ashes were scattered in Central Park, inside of their apartment. Chapman was taken to the 20th Precinct on West 82nd Street, where he was questioned for 8 hours before being brought to New York County Criminal Court on Center Street in Lower Manhattan. A judge remanded Chapman to Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. In 1981, despite advice by his lawyers to go to trial, Chapman pleaded guilty to murdering Lennon, saying that the guilty plea was the will of God. Under the terms of his guilty plea, he was sentenced to 20 years to life, with eligibility for parole in 2000. Before his sentencing, he was given the opportunity to address the court, at which point he read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye. He has been denied parole 11 times and remains incarcerated at the Wen Correctional Facility east of Buffalo, New York. Let us know what you think about this case. Were you a fan of John Lennon? And if you were a listener, perhaps you were alive when Lennon was shot. What do you remember from that moment? But that is all we have for this episode. If you'd like to support the show, consider buying us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. As always, find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and be sure to give a like and thumbs up on this video. And please hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.